beach and the river you saw in the flyover are actually about 2 to 2.5 miles behind me to the east. Welcome to my second episode of Reminders for the Journey. This house was my first real home. As I understand it, my family moved here shortly after I was born. We lived here about 5 years before moving into a new house that became our family home for the rest of the lives of my parents. An interesting thing for me about this house is that we moved out of it and into our new home on my 5th birthday, which I've always thought was kind of a cool thing. So every memory I have of this place, this yard, and this street all took place before I was 5 years old. I don't know for sure, but that may be one of the reasons I tend to have memories that are associated with dates and experiences, and why I tend to remember a lot of details in that way. In the first episode, I introduced you to my friend Tony Juliana, who unfortunately passed away in 1976. At that time, we were making our way through college and figuring out what life was really going to be about for us. I didn't know much about Tony's growing up years since we only met as freshmen in high school. I know his experiences, though, were very similar to mine. He was born here in Carlsbad, had a large family, and a dad who worked at the potash mines just as my dad did. The main difference between Tony and me in our upbringing was that Tony's family was Catholic. He attended parochial schools through 8th grade, which is why we ultimately met in the 9th grade. As far as I know, our paths never crossed before that. This was a tiny little house, especially for 4 boys and my parents. I'm guessing it was probably 1,000 square feet, maybe less. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and a living room and a kitchen. That was pretty much it, all with this simple square floor plan. My parents were young, in their late 20s, and already had the 4 of us. I'm sure a major challenge for them was keeping enough food in the house to keep us all fed. We were a group that liked to eat. I have nothing but good memories of the years that I spent in this house. In my mind, it seems like it was always summertime. Of course it wasn't, but what I remember most is being outside playing in the warm sun. My 2 older brothers were 4 and 6 years ahead of me, and my little brother was 2 years younger. That meant I had a lot of free time on my hands to play outside while my brothers were in elementary school. My mom was busy washing clothes, hanging them on a clothesline, cooking meals, and looking after my little brother. My dad worked long hours at the mine. I think that's when I learned to enjoy my own company and to find things to do that entertained me outside. One of the reasons I'm here is to tell you about something that happened to me while living in this house in the months before I turned 5 years old. What makes it so interesting is that it's one of the clearest memories that I have in my life. And because it happened when I was so young, it's also one of the oldest memories that I have. As a result, I have never questioned its validity. It has always been planted in the forefront of my memories whenever I stop to think about it. If it did not happen in the way that I remembered it, then I would have a difficult time believing that any of my old memories in my life were true. Does that make sense? In the first video, I mentioned God things, those unique experiences that happen in our lives which we can't explain without looking outside of ourselves for some kind of understanding. One of the few conclusions that a person can come to, particularly a person of faith, is that God intervened in our lives in those moments. Sometimes events like this take years to grasp the significance of. Sometimes it takes getting older and being able to think through things a little more fully. That's exactly the case with the story I'm about to share. I remember the details of what happened quite well, but it took years of running those details through my mind to realize that something really weird happened to me. In other words, I think this was a God thing. It was either late morning or early afternoon. I'm not quite sure. My older brothers were down the street to my left at Smith Park, which is a big grass-covered park with trees and playground equipment. For those of you who know the area, Smith Park is right across the street from the old Becky's A&W. I'd been taught how to cross the street. Times were different then. Neighbors looked out for the neighborhood, and we kids were running everywhere. I remember being told to always watch for traffic and look both ways before crossing the street. Mesa Street was pretty busy. It was wide enough for cars to be parked on the curb on both sides and still have room for 2 lanes of traffic going in opposite directions. I was in a hurry to catch up with my brothers at the park, so I needed to cross the street. I was really feeling quite impatient about it all. I remember standing in between 2 cars parked along the curb on our side of the street, poking my head out to look left and right for a break in the traffic. Normally that wasn't a problem, but for some reason on this day and in this moment, every time I looked, there were cars coming from one direction or the other. My frustration was growing because I knew there was a lot going on at Smith Park and I was missing out on the fun. As clear as a bell, I remember thinking, don't look anymore, just run. And with no hesitation, I bolted out into the street as fast as my little legs would carry me. The reel of movie frames in my mind tells me that I got 4 or 5 steps into the street, almost to the middle of the street, and was looking down at the asphalt in front of me. That's where the images stop. Next, I remember sounds, a honking horn, screeching tires, and I felt a bump, not a hard bump, but a light bump on the left side of my bottom. The next image in my mind is of me standing on the other side of the street, in the grass, looking back at the man in the driver's seat of the car screaming at me. I looked at the man, turned to my right, and then ran as fast as I could up the street to Smith Park. Without a worry in the world, life was good. That little 5-year-old didn't give this experience a second thought, except that I was probably more careful the next time I crossed the street by myself. But as the years have passed and I have looked back at the vivid memory, every time it is replayed, I have wondered what really happened. What was that gentle bump I felt? Why do I have no memory of getting from the middle of the street to the grass and the sidewalk on the other side? I wasn't knocked down or injured in any way. At some point, and I don't know when that was, I came to believe that I had been protected from losing my life. Had an angel given me a boot in the rear that moved me from one place to the other? Honestly, if I had to bet on it, I would say that's exactly what happened. The most puzzling part of this is how I have such vivid recollections of the events, including how I felt before I ran into the street. Yet when the tire screeched and I felt the bump, there's this block of time where my next mental image is of being safe in the grass with a guy yelling at me. It wasn't time for something terrible to happen to me, even though it could easily have been the case. In the 65 years since that event, I have honestly never thought about it turning out any other way than it did. I suppose that that's a normal way to think about it because everything did turn out okay. If you want to take it a step further, I could say, well, of course I didn't die as a result of my carelessness as a little kid. That wouldn't have been right. God wouldn't let that happen. What would have been the point or purpose in me dying in such a really senseless way? I wish that was the kind of logic and result we could always count on in life. I wish bad things didn't happen to good people or the innocent. I wish that bad people who intend to do harm to others, especially children, could always be stopped in their tracks by angels watching and intervening to protect them. But that's not the way it works in life. About 16 years after my experience, my friend Tony was approaching his 20th birthday. He had been selected for a summer internship with the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. He and a group of other interns who, like Tony, were wildlife management majors in college, spent their summer camping out 10 days out of every 14 and conducting various studies for game and fish in the northern mountains of New Mexico. Somehow, while riding in the back of a truck or a Jeep on a remote road, Tony fell over the side. Instead of being thrown clear, he fell under the vehicle and was struck by a rear tire. He sustained serious internal injuries and died a couple of days later. A number of friends of mine who know the whole story of my history and friendship with Tony have asked me the question, which is a legitimate one. Why now? Why does it matter in this point in my life to talk about Tony in this kind of way? Let me begin to answer that question by telling you about the impact his death had on me and how I dealt with it. In the first episode of Reminders for the Journey, I introduced the timeline, which represents my history of living to be 70 years old. I've had a lot of reaction to that from people who find it to be an interesting way to look at our lives. Having created it myself with a specific purpose in mind, I've found it quite useful. However, unless you have a purpose to do something like this, I'm not sure that I would recommend it. The reason being, it does make you reflect on all of your years. And if you're anything like me, there are some periods of time in there that I would prefer not to be reminded of. As we move back down the timeline of history, I have put some storm clouds over a few of those periods in my life just to let you know that they happened. Lucky for you, I don't feel any desire to share anything more specific with you about those times. But I want to move back to the time when Tony was living, and I've added his timeline next to mine. You'll also notice that there's this blue bank of clouds that has followed me down the timeline, and its purpose is to remind us of the reality of life, that regardless of our age, we cannot see what's ahead. We can look into the past and see that Tony's life is very similar to what mine was. One thing you'll notice is that Tony's timeline starts in 1956 and mine in 1955. As I've said earlier, he and I met as freshmen in high school. So how did we get to be in the same grade? I didn't learn the story about that until Tony and I were probably juniors in high school, when something about our birth dates and ages came up in conversation. When I pressed him on it, he kind of was sheepish about it a little bit and told me that he had skipped a grade in elementary school at his mother's insistence. His mother, Lorraine, described it later in a story she wrote about Tony, saying, "He was such a sweet little boy. He had a happy and good-natured disposition. He laughed a lot, and he did exceptionally well in school, skipping the fourth grade entirely because of his high achievement test scores at the end of the third grade." When I heard Tony's explanation, I wasn't surprised and actually thought it was kind of cool that he had done that. But for some reason, he was a little embarrassed about it. He was already setting himself apart as a brilliant guy and a good student to those of us who were in classes with him. When we finished high school, Tony ranked number 2 in grade point average in our graduating class of over 500 students. But you would never know that he was as smart as he was, just interacting with him, because he was such a pleasant and caring guy with anyone he encountered. I have many stories to tell about our time together in high school as high school students and how we became friends. It was interesting also that we both took different tracks on our spiritual journeys as well as we were entering college. And it wasn't until the spring semester of our freshman year in college that we both shared with each other what happened to us regarding our faith during our first semester in college. The delay was because we were both apprehensive that the other might not understand and that it might have a negative impact on our friendship. The opposite was actually true. In later episodes, I will revisit those days of how our friendship developed to become so strong in a relatively short period of time. When I heard of Tony's death, it was Friday, July 23rd, 1976. And the news came in a call from my dad, who had just been notified of what had happened. I was a junior ministerial student at Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, Texas. Tony and I had just talked on the phone about 10 days earlier, and Tony had written a follow-up letter that I received about a week before his death. My initial reaction was disbelief, obviously, because of my recent call and letter from Tony. But the news was coming from my dad, so it quickly sank in. Tony's funeral was 3 days later, on Monday, July 26, 1976, in Carlsbad on Tony's 20th birthday. As I processed what had happened, I was initially devastated. The tragedy of it was so far-reaching, and the plans, aspirations, and hopes that Tony had that disappeared in a moment's time were hard to even begin to calculate the far-reaching impact of. For me, I had recently been memorizing scripture through a program the Navigators had that some of you may be familiar with. A passage I had just memorized a few weeks earlier came to mind, and it established the baseline to stabilize my emotions in the initial days after Tony's death, and actually for many years to come after that. The passage is from Philippians chapter 1, where the writer Paul tells his friends at Philippi, "I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making request with joy for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will continue to perform it until the day of Christ Jesus." What I took from that was a sense of assurance that God had been working in and through Tony's life and mine as well, and that I could be confident that God had finished his work in Tony's life, or else Tony would not have died. Well, it's pretty simplistic, but I knew that I needed to get it together and move on because my life was unfolding before me as well. And as long as my life continued, I needed to stay on the path that was important to me. That's what Tony would have wanted without a doubt. That realization made accepting Tony's death actually a little easier, but mostly because there was nothing else I could do. Tony had died. I vowed to never forget Tony, and certainly never have. I had his letter, which was very special. One of his purposes for the call and the letter was to talk about the importance of our friendship, and that we needed to keep it a priority. Because of our busy college lives, we had let a year go by without being in touch. I made it a habit to read his letter about every 5 years or so at a minimum. In the ups and downs in life and over the 40 years, I found his letter to be helpful in a variety of ways with the ever-changing seasons of my own life. But there was one thing that bothered me that was never quite settled in that message from Philippians chapter 1. And that was, how could Tony's life and purpose really have been fulfilled and completed with the tragic end and suddenness of his death? That question had never really gone away, and after 40 years, as I was getting ready to turn 60, I began to struggle with some of the things relating to Tony's death. Today, I think my frustration about Tony was a part of a grand plan that was playing out over the past 40 years since his death. God is the master teacher, and often the steps to us growing in our faith come as a result of something not settling well with us, as was the case with Tony's death. I don't find myself in the situation often, but when circumstances cause me to question God, a few times angrily, I get very candid with him. Trust me, he can handle it. I'll tell you the full story to the resolution of that situation in a later video as well. But with a little time, maybe 3 months, I started to get the sense that God had not finished the complete work in Tony's life after all. I also realized that the time was coming that I would need to choose if I was going to fill the space that was there for me to fill in Tony's life, having new meaning 50 years after his death. You see, I was being given access to experiences, to people, to memories, documents, connections, all related to Tony, and at least for this period of time, I was the gathering point. The choices were so clearly presented to me that I said at one point, if there is more to this than just a few coincidences and a story you need me to tell, absolutely, I'm in. The God things were getting ready to be a good portion of my life in my 60s. So back to the question of why am I doing this at this time in my life so long after Tony died? I have two responses, and the first deals with me. There's not much difference in attitude between the 5-year-old little guy who was wanting to cross the street to get to Smith Park and this 70-year-old guy making videos in a 3D virtual world. I hate to miss out on the fun. I think there are some special things going on concerning remembering Tony's life, and I don't want to miss out on being a part of it. And the second reason, every year a group of kids turns 20 years of age. Seems like there is more broad general confusion and lack of direction in that generation than there has ever been in my lifetime. People who are still alive and knew Tony are in their 60s and 70s for the most part. I've never known a person of any age who has been more comfortable in their own skin and in who they were than Tony was. I'm guessing that most people who knew him would agree with that. I was told that Tony's oldest brother, Bob, who was 13 years older than Tony, once said, God took Tony so young because he was too good for this world. Maybe so, Bob. All I know is that there are a bunch of us older people who were forever impacted by who Tony was, the choices that he made, and how he lived his life. There are lessons and stories about Tony for everyone, regardless of your age, and I'm happy to share those with you.